On screen, he was the untamable outlaw, the stoic gunslinger who redefined American masculinity. Off-screen, he died a blind 400-pound prisoner with iron chains padlocked around his refrigerator. He weaponized his childhood trauma to extort millions from Hollywood executives, but that same chaos destroyed his bloodline. His fortune was drained defending his son for murder, while his daughter hung herself. The truth is brutal. Hollywood never destroyed Marlon Brando. They simply financed his methodical self-destruction. Marlon Brando Jr. was born on April 3, 1924, in Omaha, Nebraska. His household was defined by constant physical violence and psychological manipulation. His father, Marlon Brando Sr., worked as a pesticide and chemical feed salesman. He was a brutal disciplinarian who maintained strict control over his family through corporal punishment and verbal abuse. He targeted his son specifically, beating him regularly. He systematically attacked the boy's self-worth, telling him repeatedly that he was stupid, inadequate, and would never succeed at anything. This abuse was a daily, structural reality of Brando's childhood. His mother, Dorothy Dodie Pennebaker, was a severe chronic alcoholic. Her addiction dictated the family's daily life. She frequently abandoned her children, disappearing into local bars for days at a time. Throughout his early years in Omaha and later in Evanston, Illinois, Brando was forced to act as his mother's caretaker. After school, his routine consisted of searching local taverns to find her. Once located, he had to physically drag his heavily intoxicated mother off bar stools and bring her home before his father returned to beat them both. Trapped in this environment, Brando developed his first coping mechanism. He realized standard communication failed when his mother was intoxicated or depressed. To distract her and stall her drinking, he started mimicking the sounds of farm animals. He reproduced the noises of cows, horses, and chickens with exact precision. This was not an early artistic pursuit. It was a calculated psychological tactic. He observed that if he could entertain his mother and make her laugh, he could temporarily diffuse the immediate tension in the house. He learned early on that behavior and physical presence could be used to manipulate unpredictable adults. As the family relocated to Libertyville, Illinois, Brando's survival tactics evolved into destructive rebellion. Unable to control the violence at home, he created chaos in his neighborhood. He carried a pocket knife. He slashed the tires of neighbors' cars. He used a BB gun to shoot out windows and destroy private property. In school, he refused to complete assignments and directly defied teachers. By 1941, Marlon Sr. decided to force his son into submission. He enrolled Brando at the Shattuck Military Academy in Faribault, Minnesota, the same institution the father had attended. The academy operated on a strict hierarchy and demanded absolute obedience. Brando immediately rejected the system. He committed routine uniform violations, argued with commanding officers, and snuck out of his barracks at night. His most significant act of sabotage at Shattuck, however, proved his ability to deceive structured authority. One night, Brando broke into the Shattuck campus bell tower. He detached the solid brass clapper, weighing 150 pounds, from the main bell. He carried the heavy metal piece down the stairs, dragged it across the campus, and buried it in the dirt. This act disabled the academy's ability to signal daily drills, class changes, and morning formations. The administration launched a massive investigation to find the culprit. Recognizing the risk of expulsion, Brando took proactive control of the situation. He volunteered to lead the student committee assigned to assist the faculty with the investigation. Brando sat in interrogation meetings with furious military instructors, acting entirely innocent and concerned. He directed the student search parties, purposely leading them away from the spot where he had buried the clapper. He played the role of the loyal cadet so effectively that the administration never suspected him during the primary search. This incident demonstrated his flawless ability to lie, mimic subordinate behavior, and successfully control the psychology of those holding institutional power. Despite evading capture for the Bell incident, Brando's continued insubordination resulted in his expulsion during his senior year for a separate violation. He was sent back to his father's house in Libertyville. As punishment, his father forced him to work as a ditch digger for the town's drainage system. Brando spent the summer of 1943 doing heavy manual labor. By this time, the trauma of his father's violence and his mother's neglect had equipped him with specific psychological tools. He knew how to observe human vulnerability, project false emotions, and subvert authority. At 19 years old, he possessed a highly developed mechanism for manipulation. In the winter of 1943, he quit his job digging ditches, packed his bags, and took a train to New York City. New York City in the winter of 1943 was the epicenter of the American theatrical establishment. The industry was rigid, polite, and highly manufactured. Actors on Broadway were trained to speak in artificial mid-Atlantic accents. They were instructed on exactly how to stand, how to enunciate, and how to project their voices to the back row of the theater. The performances were technical and sterile. Marlon Brando arrived in this environment with no formal training, a deeply ingrained hostility toward authority, and empty pockets. Before stepping onto a stage, he survived in the city by working a series of menial jobs. He worked as an elevator operator at the Best & Company department store. He worked as a sandwich board man, walking the streets carrying advertisements. He worked as a short-order cook. He was not a driven artist looking for fame. He was a 19-year-old drifter who had just escaped a violently abusive home. His entry into the theater was entirely pragmatic. He enrolled in the dramatic workshop at the New School for Social Research, primarily because his sister had studied there. It was here that he met Stella Adler, a teacher who would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life and the business of Hollywood. Stella Adler was a highly respected acting instructor who had studied directly under Konstantin Stanislavski in Paris. She taught a radical new system that would later be commercialized as method acting. The Stanislavski system demanded that actors stop pretending. Instead, they had to actively mine their own personal memories, traumas, and psychological wounds, dragging those real emotions to the surface to use as fuel for the character. Adler immediately recognized the severe psychological damage in Brando. She bypassed his abrasive defenses and took him under her wing, acting as a surrogate mother figure. She brought him into her home, fed him, declared him an honorary Jew, and even taught him Yiddish. More importantly, Adler taught Brando how to monetize his defense mechanisms. She instructed him to take the suppressed rage he harbored toward his violent father and the deep-seated anxiety caused by his alcoholic mother and channel those exact feelings into his scene work. A documented exercise in Adler's class perfectly summarized Brando's grounded, hyper-realistic approach. Adler instructed the students to act as chickens facing an impending atomic bomb explosion. When she gave the cue, the rest of the class erupted into chaos, running around the room, clucking frantically, and flapping their arms in panic. Brando did not move. He sat calmly in a corner, perfectly still, and pretended to lay an egg. When Adler asked him to explain his choice, Brando stated bluntly that a chicken has no concept of what an atomic bomb is. His logic was absolute. He refused to perform artificial panic. This sheer, unpretentious realism became his trademark. The Broadway industry quickly noticed this untamed energy. Producers realized that Brando's raw presence commanded the attention of an audience in a way the polished, traditional actors could not. He made his Broadway debut in I Remember Mama, followed by Truckline Cafe, a play co-produced by Elia Kazan. Kazan noted that Brando did not look like an actor reciting lines. He looked like a highly volatile individual who might snap at any moment. But as Brando began to secure consistent work, his inherent hatred of authority resurfaced. He despised the rigid etiquette of the traditional theater. In 1946, he was cast in The Eagle Has Two Heads, starring opposite Tallulah Bankhead. Bankhead was Broadway royalty, a massive star of the old theatrical guard. Brando viewed her acting style as fake and overblown. Rather than conforming to the production, Brando actively sabotaged it. During performances, when Bankhead was delivering long, dramatic monologues, Brando would stand behind her and purposefully ruin the scene. He picked his nose. He visibly scratched his crotch. He rolled his eyes and fidgeted. It was a calculated, physical insult aimed directly at the theatrical establishment. Bankhead was furious. Brando was fired before the play even opened on Broadway. It was a clear declaration that he would weaponize his own lack of discipline to destroy any system he did not respect. His firing, however, set the stage for the most significant turning point of his career and the beginning of his true exploitation by the entertainment industry. In the summer of 1947, a new play by Tennessee Williams was in pre-production. It was called A Streetcar Named Desire. The production was backed by powerful, wealthy Broadway investors, spearheaded by producer Irene Mayer Selznick. Williams was staying at a house in Provincetown, Massachusetts, holding auditions for the lead male role of Stanley Kowalski. Brando, completely broke, hitchhiked from New York to Massachusetts. He arrived several days late. When he finally reached the house, it was in total disrepair. The plumbing was broken, the toilets were overflowing, and the house was in darkness due to blown fuses. Before even discussing the play, Brando went to work. He manually repaired the plumbing. He fixed the electrical fuses. He restored power and water to the house. Only after completing the manual labor did he sit down in the living room and read the script for Tennessee Williams. Williams later documented that it was the most magnificent, powerful reading he had ever witnessed. Brando was cast immediately. On December 3, 1947, A Streetcar Named Desire opened at the Ethel Barrymore Theater. The landscape of American entertainment changed overnight. Brando's portrayal of Stanley Kowalski was animalistic, violent, and utterly captivating. He stalked the stage in a torn, sweat-stained t-shirt. He screamed. He broke things, and he exuded a dangerous sexuality that Broadway audiences had never seen. The play was a massive commercial triumph. It ran for 855 performances. The producers raked in millions. Brando became a national phenomenon and an instant sex symbol. But the factual reality of that success was incredibly dark. The industry and the public were celebrating a performance that was actively tearing Brando apart. Brando despised the character of Stanley Kowalski. Kowalski was a brutal, physically abusive, dominating man who destroyed the women around him. To Brando, Kowalski was the exact mirror image of Marlon Brando Sr. to deliver the performance that the producers demanded. Brando had to utilize the method techniques Adler taught him. He had to mentally resurrect his father. He had to tap into the exact violence and psychological terror he had suffered as a child, channel it through his own body, and unleash it on stage 6 nights a week, plus matinees. The theatrical capitalist did not care about the psychological toll this took on a 23-year-old man. They saw a packed house. They saw unprecedented ticket sales. They recognized that Brando's trauma was highly marketable. For 2 straight years on Broadway, the industry forced Marlon Brando to step onto a stage and impersonate his own abuser, selling his deepest psychological wounds to an applauding public. He became a money-printing machine, fueled entirely by his unresolved childhood pain. By the time the play closed, he was mentally exhausted, deeply cynical, and fully aware of how the entertainment business operated. He was ready to take this cynicism to Hollywood. The American film industry in 1950 was an industrial complex disguised as an art form. The major studios, Warner Brothers, MGM, 20th Century Fox, and Paramount, operated under the rigid constraints of the star system. Actors were treated as high-value indentured servants. They signed exclusive 7-year contracts. The studios dictated what movies they made, what clothes they wore in public, who they dated, and what they said to the press. If an actor refused a role, they were suspended without pay. If an actor violated a morals clause, their career was instantly terminated. Marlon Brando arrived in Hollywood fully aware of this trap. Having just spent 2 years being psychologically drained by the Broadway producers of A Streetcar Named Desire, he viewed studio executives with absolute contempt. He did not travel to Los Angeles to become a movie star. He went to Los Angeles because the film industry offered massive financial payouts, and he intended to extract that money on his own terms. His first cinematic project was The Men, produced by Stanley Kramer. The film focused on World War II veterans dealing with severe spinal cord injuries. The Hollywood standard for this type of role was surface-level imitation. Actors would sit in a wheelchair, deliver their lines, and walk to their dressing rooms when the director called cut. Brando fundamentally disrupted this standard. He refused to pretend. To prepare for the role of a paralyzed lieutenant, Brando checked himself into the Birmingham General Army Hospital in Van Nuys, California. He confined himself to a bed in the paraplegic ward for 3 entire weeks. He lived alongside actual paralyzed veterans. He underwent their physical therapy routines. He learned how to propel a wheelchair using only his upper body strength. And he studied the exact physical atrophy and psychological depression that accompanied a severed spine. The studio executives were baffled. They viewed this extreme preparation as a waste of time and an unnecessary risk. But the result on screen was undeniable. Brando brought a harsh, documentary-style realism to Hollywood fiction. The performance was gritty, unpolished, and completely devoid of traditional cinematic glamour. Sensing the immense commercial power of this new, raw aesthetic, Warner Brothers immediately moved to capitalize on it. In 1951, they financed the film adaptation of A Streetcar Named Desire, directed by Elia Kazan. When the film hit theaters, it triggered a cultural explosion. Brando's reprisal of Stanley Kowalski projected a suffocating, aggressive sexuality onto the massive cinema screens across the country. The visual impact was unprecedented. The studio's marketing department utilized his physical appearance to sell tickets. They plastered posters of Brando wearing a skin-tight, sweat-soaked white t-shirt. Prior to 1951, the t-shirt was considered strictly underwear. Men did not wear it in public. After A Streetcar Named Desire, national sales of t-shirts skyrocketed. Warner Brothers realized they had a unique product. They were no longer just selling a movie ticket. They were selling an aesthetic of rebellious masculinity. They mass-produced the image of the brooding, violent outsider, packaging Brando's genuine psychological intensity for a post-war American audience hungry for something dangerous. Brando despised the Kowalski character, yet the film earned him his first Academy Award nomination and permanently cemented his status as a global commodity. Over the next 3 years, Brando established a monopoly on critical acclaim. He proved that his method technique could dominate any genre. In 1952, he traveled to local towns in Mexico to study the speech patterns and physical mannerisms of the locals, before starring as the revolutionary Emiliano Zapata in Viva Zapata. In 1953, he directly challenged the old guard of the acting establishment. He was cast as Mark Antony in MGM's adaptation of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. The cast was filled with classically trained, prestigious British theatre actors, including John Gielgud. The British actors privately mocked Brando's casting, assuming the mumbling method actor would be incapable of handling Shakespearean dialogue. Instead, Brando combined the rigid, classical text with his visceral, grounded emotional technique. He completely overpowered the veteran actors on screen, securing his 3rd consecutive Oscar nomination and proving that the old theatrical rules were officially obsolete. But it was later that same year that the Hollywood machine successfully weaponized Brando's image to create a new, highly lucrative consumer demographic. The teenager. In The Wild One, Brando played Johnny Strabler, the leader of the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club. The film itself was a straightforward, somewhat exaggerated take on a real-life biker riot in Hollister, California. However, the visual iconography of the film changed American culture. Brando appeared on screen riding a Triumph Thunderbird 6T motorcycle, wearing a customized shot perfecto leather jacket and sporting sideburns. When asked in the film, "What are you rebelling against, Johnny?" Brando delivered the iconic, indifferent response, "Wadaya got." The studios struck gold. They had successfully commercialized anti-establishment sentiment. They sold the concept of teenage rebellion to the exact youth culture that would soon embrace rock and roll. Brando's image in The Wild One directly inspired James Dean's persona and Elvis Presley's entire visual aesthetic. The system was generating millions of dollars by selling Brando as the ultimate icon of defiance, while simultaneously trying to keep him under strict contractual control. This tension between his artistic dominance and his hatred of the studio system culminated in 1954 with On the Waterfront. Directed again by Elia Kazan, the film was a gritty, brutal look at union corruption and mob violence on the docks of Hoboken, New Jersey. Brando played Terry Malloy, an uneducated, washed-up prizefighter who works for the corrupt union bosses. The performance is historically recognized as one of the greatest in cinematic history. The famous "I could have been a contender" scene in the back of a taxicab was largely improvised. Brando pushed back against the original script, arguing that a man facing a gun from his own brother would react with sorrow, not anger. He gently pushed the gun away, altering the emotional core of the film. On the Waterfront earned Brando the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was at the absolute zenith of Hollywood power. He had delivered the defining performance of his generation, and he cared so little about the establishment's validation that the Oscar statue itself was treated like garbage. He lost the physical trophy shortly after winning it. It vanished from his home, only to resurface decades later in 1994 when an auction house in London nearly sold it before it was recovered. Following the Oscar win, the uneasy truce between Brando and the Hollywood executives finally collapsed. Brando initiated an active, calculated war against the studio system. In the summer of 1954, Brando was scheduled to begin filming The Egyptian, a massive historical epic produced by 20th Century Fox. The studio was run by Darryl F. Zanuck, one of the most powerful and ruthless executives in the industry. Zanuck had cast his own personal mistress, Bella Darby, in a leading role. Brando attended exactly one rehearsal. He looked at the script, looked at the casting of Darby, and recognized the project as a blatant, creatively bankrupt vanity project engineered by a studio boss. He refused to participate. Without warning the producers, Brando walked off the set, packed his bags, and fled to New York. Zanuck was enraged. In the Hollywood studio system, an actor walking off a multi-million-dollar production was an act of treason. Zanuck immediately mobilized the legal power of 20th Century Fox. The studio filed a massive $2 million breach of contract lawsuit against Brando. Furthermore, they utilized their political connections to have U.S. Marshals actively tracked the actor down. Facing total financial ruin from the lawsuit, Brando was forced to capitulate. His lawyers negotiated a settlement. To drop the $2 million suit, Brando agreed to pay a $75 Zerozo penalty out of his own pocket and sign a contract to star in another 20th Century Fox historical film, Desiree, playing the role of Napoleon Bonaparte. The studio thought they had broken him. They believed the lawsuit had forced him back into submission. They were completely wrong. Brando arrived on the set of Desiree with the explicit intention of sabotaging the multi-million-dollar production from the inside. He viewed the director, Henry Koster, with absolute contempt and refused to follow his directions. He intentionally refused to memorize his lines, requiring countless expensive retakes. During filming, he spoke in a bizarre, mocking, fake British accent that made no historical sense for the character of Napoleon. He intentionally ruined the framing of shots. In one documented incident, he found a live fire hose on the studio lot and turned it directly onto the background extras, completely disrupting the shooting schedule and costing the studio thousands of dollars in delays. He fulfilled his legal obligation to be on the set, but he ensured that 20th Century Fox paid heavily for forcing him there. His campaign of on-set psychological warfare escalated significantly the following year during the production of the musical Guys and Dolls. The film was an adaptation of the hit Broadway musical, produced by Samuel Goldwyn. Brando was cast in the lead role of Sky Masterson. This casting infuriated his co-star, Frank Sinatra. Sinatra, who was cast in the secondary role of Nathan Detroit, desperately wanted the lead role for himself. Sinatra was a product of the old Hollywood machine. He valued precise vocal timing, traditional star power, and absolute respect on set. He despised Brando's method acting, viewing it as pretentious and unprofessional. Sinatra openly mocked Brando to the press and the crew, famously nicknaming him Mumbles. Brando, fully aware of Sinatra's hostility and his powerful industry connections, decided to retaliate. He did not engage in shouting matches. Instead, he used his acting technique as a weapon to physically torture Sinatra. During a crucial scene, Sinatra's character was required to eat a piece of New York cheesecake while delivering a line of dialogue. Brando knew for a fact that Sinatra absolutely hated cheesecake. When the cameras rolled, the scene played out perfectly until the very last line. Right before the director yelled cut, Brando intentionally mumbled his dialogue or missed his mark, ruining the take. The director was forced to reset. The prop department brought out a fresh piece of heavy cheesecake. Sinatra had to eat it again. Brando intentionally sabotaged the scene 9 consecutive times. He forced Frank Sinatra to consume 9 heavy pieces of a dessert he despised. By the 9th take, Sinatra was physically sick and enraged. He erupted in a screaming fit, slammed his fork down, and stormed off the set, demanding that the director stop Brando from ruining the scene. Years later, a rumor circulated that Sinatra had leveraged his connections with the Italian mafia to have Brando kidnapped and intimidated as revenge for this treatment. Historical records have proven this to be a fabricated urban legend. The factual reality was much more mundane. Brando, deeply curious about criminal psychology for his roles, had simply gone for a voluntary ride with several local organized crime figures in New York to study their mannerisms. But the damage on the set of Guys and Dolls was done. Brando had proven his point. He had established a new reality in Hollywood. He showed that he could take the biggest pop star in the world, the most powerful studio executives in the industry, and the most rigid legal contracts, and break them all through sheer calculated indiscipline. He had survived the physical and legal threats of the Golden Age studio system. As the decade drew to a close, Brando realized that acting out on set was no longer enough. If he truly wanted to punish the Hollywood machine, he needed to stop attacking their schedules and start attacking their bank accounts. The catalyst was the death of his mother, Dodie. Despite her severe alcoholism and the trauma she inflicted upon him through neglect, she remained the psychological anchor of his life. Her death triggered a catastrophic mental collapse. Brando began suffering from acute, paralyzing panic attacks. The man who projected absolute invincibility on screen was completely immobilized behind closed doors. Forced to confront his unraveling mental state, he committed himself to intensive long-term psychoanalysis under the care of Dr. Bella Middleman. Therapy stripped away the remaining illusions Brando held about his profession. Through his sessions with Dr. Middleman, he deconstructed his own career. He realized that the Hollywood studio system was not a patron of the arts. It was a parasitic financial structure. He recognized that the executives, the men in suits who dictated his schedules, controlled his contracts, and profited off his emotional breakdowns, were the ultimate authority figures. And just like the military academy administrators and Broadway producers before them, they needed to be dismantled. Brando fundamentally altered his strategy. He decided he was no longer going to wage war through petty on-set tantrums or artistic disagreements. If the studios were solely concerned with money, he would attack their capital. He transitioned from a rebellious artist into a financial mercenary. His new weapon of choice was calculated, extreme financial sabotage. His first major strike against the studio system's bank accounts was the Western film One-Eyed Jacks. Originally, the film was a standard production backed by Paramount Pictures, with Stanley Kubrick hired to direct. Kubrick, a notorious perfectionist with a rigid vision, clashed immediately with Brando. Brando did not simply argue with Kubrick, he wielded his star power to have Kubrick fired from the project entirely. With the director gone, Brando successfully maneuvered himself into the director's chair, taking total creative and operational control over a multi-million-dollar studio asset. Once in control, Brando unleashed a bizarre, obsessive brand of perfectionism designed specifically to bleed Paramount's budget. The original budget for One-Eyed Jacks was set at a standard $2 million. Under Brando's direction, the schedule evaporated. He refused to adhere to daily shooting pages. He demanded constant, highly expensive script rewrites on the day of filming. His tactics to burn capital were incredibly specific. During a location shoot on the coast of the Monterey Peninsula, Brando halted the entire production. He ordered a film crew of hundreds, cameramen, lighting technicians, sound engineers, and background actors to stand idle on the beach for 2 solid hours. The meter was running. Thousands of dollars were draining from the studio's budget by the minute. When the frantic producers demanded to know what he was waiting for, Brando coldly informed them that he was waiting for a specific ocean wave to crash against a specific rock at the exact right angle. He forced an entire corporate infrastructure to freeze, bleeding money, simply because he had the power to do so. By the time he finally wrapped production, he had driven the film's budget from $2 million to a staggering $6 million. But the financial hemorrhage of One-Eyed Jacks was merely a warm-up. The most devastating, ruinous attack Brando ever launched against a studio occurred the following year, during the production of Mutiny on the Bounty. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was one of the oldest and most prestigious studios in Hollywood. They envisioned Mutiny on the Bounty as a massive, sweeping historical epic that would dominate the box office. They hired Brando for the lead role of Fletcher Christian, offering him a massive upfront salary. However, Brando's legal team successfully negotiated a specific clause into his contract. For every single day the production went over its scheduled timeline, Brando would be paid an exorbitant penalty fee of $5,000 per day. In 1962, this was an astronomical sum. Brando saw the clause not as a safety net, but as an opportunity for extortion. He arrived on the set in Tahiti with the explicit intention of destroying the production schedule. His sabotage was methodical. He demanded that the script be entirely rewritten, and then rejected the rewrites as soon as they were delivered. He refused to step out of his dressing room for hours, citing vague illnesses or artistic disagreements. When he finally did appear on set, he actively ignored the director, Louis Milestone. To ensure he did not have to listen to Milestone's instructions, Brando inserted physical earplugs into his ears before the cameras rolled. He completely isolated himself, forcing the director and the crew to work entirely around his silent, obstinate presence. The original shooting schedule for Mutiny on the Bounty was established at 4 months. Through sheer engineered obstruction, Brando dragged the production out to 10 agonizing months. MGM was trapped. They had already invested millions into the sets, the replica ships, and the location shoots in the South Pacific. They could not fire their lead actor without scrapping the entire film, and they could not control him. They were forced to sit and watch as Brando actively looted their corporate treasury. Through his daily $5,000 penalty clause, Brando systematically drained an additional $750,000 directly from MGM's accounts. He did not invest this money back into his career or save it. He used the bloody, extorted funds to purchase the Tetiaroa Atoll, a 2-square-mile ring of coral islands in French Polynesia. He essentially forced a major Hollywood studio to buy him a private island as punishment for hiring him. The financial fallout was catastrophic. The extreme budget overruns and production delays on Mutiny on the Bounty created a massive financial black hole. The film failed to recoup its inflated costs at the box office, and the losses nearly drove Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer into complete permanent bankruptcy. Brando had successfully brought one of the foundational pillars of the Hollywood studio system to its knees. Having proven he could financially break a studio, Brando entered the mid to late 1960s with a new philosophy. He abandoned any pretense of artistic integrity. He openly referred to this era of his career as his FU years. During this period, he deliberately accepted roles in a string of critically panned, commercially disastrous films, projects like A Countess from Hong Kong, The Appaloosa, and Candy. He took these roles entirely for the upfront cash payouts. He viewed the work as purely transactional, a way to fund his private life and his island in Tahiti, while simultaneously insulting the industry that relied on his name. To maximize his insult to the film industry, Brando weaponized laziness. The young actor, who had once confined himself to a paraplegic ward for weeks to prepare for a role, now outright refused to read his scripts. He viewed memorizing dialogue as beneath him, a waste of his time that the studios had not adequately paid for. He pioneered a practice that would become his most infamous trademark, the use of cue cards. Brando demanded that the production crew write his dialogue on large pieces of cardboard. He then ordered the crew to tape these cards all over the set. They were taped to walls, hidden behind props, and stuck to the sides of cameras. He even went as far as forcing the crew to tape his lines directly onto the bodies of his co-stars. When the camera was rolling, Brando would not look his fellow actors in the eye. He would be actively reading the words taped to their chests. This was not an eccentricity or a symptom of a failing memory. It was a calculated physical manifestation of his contempt. By refusing to learn his lines, he removed all spontaneity from the scenes. He forced the directors to lock down their camera angles to hide the cue cards. He forced the other actors to remain rigidly in place so he could read off them. He successfully crippled the entire creative process, loudly broadcasting to the executives, the crew, and the public that he prioritized his own comfort and financial extraction over the art of filmmaking. The Hollywood establishment, obsessed with profit margins, had no defense against a star who actively wanted to produce bad movies. They had built an industry on the assumption that actors desperately wanted to be famous and respected. Brando stripped away that leverage. He proved that an actor completely devoid of ambition, who operated purely out of spite and financial greed, was the most dangerous threat to the studio system. He had spent the 1950s proving he was the greatest actor of his generation. He spent the 1960s proving that he simply did not care. By the dawn of the 1970s, the Hollywood establishment believed they had finally neutralized Marlon Brando. A decade of intentional financial sabotage, box office failures, and blatant on-set hostility had successfully branded him as industry poison. Studio executives blacklisted him in boardrooms, concluding that no amount of talent was worth the guaranteed logistical nightmares and budget overruns. He was exiled to his private island in Tahiti, seemingly obsolete. But the studio system fundamentally underestimated their own greed. They had created a machine that prioritized profit above all else, and when a project arose that desperately required a monumental anchor to ensure its financial success, they were forced to crawl back to the monster they helped create. The project was The Godfather. Paramount Pictures owned the rights to Mario Puzo's best-selling novel, but the production was plagued by executive infighting. Director Francis Ford Coppola knew that the role of the aging mafia patriarch, Vito Corleone, required an actor with an undeniable, heavy, and dangerous aura. Coppola wanted Brando. The executives at Paramount vehemently refused. Stanley Jaffe, the president of the studio, explicitly stated on record that as long as he was in charge, Brando would never appear in a Paramount picture. They demanded Laurence Olivier or Ernest Borgnine. Coppola persisted. To appease the terrified executives, Coppola tricked Brando into filming a makeup test at his home. Brando knew exactly what was happening, and he understood the power dynamic. He allowed Coppola to film him. He rubbed black shoe polish into his hair, shoved crumpled tissue paper into his cheeks to create the illusion of a sagging bulldog jaw, and adopted a raspy, whispered voice. He transformed into an aging, lethal mob boss right in front of the camera. When Paramount executives saw the unlabeled footage, they were mesmerized, not realizing it was the man they had blacklisted. Once his identity was revealed, their greed overrode their principles. However, to protect their finances from Brando's notorious sabotage tactics, Paramount forced him into a humiliating contract. They offered him an insultingly low, upfront salary of $50,000, demanded he put up his own money as a financial bond against production delays, and forced him to sign away major back-end percentages in exchange for quick cash. Brando accepted the draconian terms. He did not do it out of a renewed love for cinema. He did it to prove a point. He wanted to demonstrate that he still held absolute dominion over the screen. He arrived on set and completely reconstructed the American crime genre. His portrayal of Vito Corleone, stroking a stray cat while quietly ordering a violent beating, was a masterclass in restrained menace. The Godfather became the highest-grossing film ever made at that time, saving Paramount from financial ruin and single-handedly resurrecting Brando's unassailable power in Hollywood. He won his second Academy Award for Best Actor, but having conquered the studio system once again, Brando's contempt shifted targets. He stopped focusing his warfare solely on the executives and began actively participating in the brutalization of his fellow artists. The very same year The Godfather premiered, Brando starred in Last Tango in Paris. This production marked the absolute darkest chapter of his career, moving from financial sabotage to verifiable artistic violence. Directed by Italian filmmaker Bernardo Bertolucci, the film was an exploration of a toxic, anonymous sexual relationship. Brando, aged 48, starred opposite Maria Schneider, a 19-year-old French actress. The film is notorious for a scene involving simulated sexual assault, using a stick of butter as a lubricant. The undeniable, historical reality of this scene is a textbook example of industry exploitation. The concept of using the butter was not in the script. It was secretly devised by Brando and Bertolucci on the morning of the shoot. They deliberately colluded to keep the 19-year-old Schneider completely uninformed about the physical details of the scene until the cameras were actively rolling. Decades later, in a 2013 interview, Bertolucci confessed on camera that they intentionally ambushed Schneider. He explicitly stated, "I wanted her reaction as a girl, not as an actress." He wanted to capture genuine, unsimulated humiliation and shock, and he used Brando as the physical instrument to extract it. Schneider was trapped on a closed set, legally bound by her contract, and overpowered by two massive industry figures. She later testified that she felt deeply humiliated and explicitly stated, "I felt raped by both of them." The Hollywood establishment and the global film industry completely ignored the ethical depravity of the shoot. Instead, they packaged Schneider's authentic trauma, marketed the film's extreme controversy to sell tickets, and hailed the picture as a masterpiece of modern cinema. Brando was praised for his brave, vulnerable performance, while Schneider was entirely abandoned by the industry. Scarred by the betrayal and the subsequent public objectification, she spiraled into severe depression and drug addiction. Battling mental health crises until her death in 2011, Brando, meanwhile, claimed that the emotional extraction of Last Tango in Paris had exhausted him. He felt that he had revealed too much of his own inner darkness. In a twisted display of hypocrisy, after actively participating in the psychological destruction of his young co-star for the sake of a film, he decided to publicly posture as a moral crusader against Hollywood's cruelty. This hypocrisy took center stage on March 27, 1973, at the 45th Academy Awards. Brando was heavily favored to win Best Actor for The Godfather. Instead of attending, he orchestrated a highly publicized ambush. When his name was announced as the winner, Brando did not appear. Instead, a young woman dressed in traditional Apache attire walked onto the stage. She introduced herself as Sachin Littlefeather. With a polite but firm voice, Littlefeather declined the Oscar on Brando's behalf, stating that his refusal was a direct protest against the film industry's degrading, stereotypical portrayals of Native Americans and the ongoing federal standoff at Wounded Knee. The room erupted into a mixture of cheers and vicious booing. A long-standing Hollywood myth claims that legendary Western star John Wayne was so enraged by the protest that he had to be physically restrained by 6 security guards to prevent him from storming the stage and assaulting Littlefeather. While recent historical investigations suggest the physical restraint story was highly exaggerated, the hostile, racist reaction from the Hollywood elite was very real. Brando used the Academy Awards as a weapon to humiliate the industry on a global broadcast. But true to the chaotic, manipulative nature of his life, even his grand moral protest was built on a lie. Littlefeather was subsequently blacklisted by the studios, her acting career destroyed by her association with Brando's stunt. However, shortly after her death in 2022, an exhaustive investigation by the San Francisco Chronicle, corroborated by her own biological sisters, revealed a stunning truth. Sachin Littlefeather had 0 Native American ancestry. She was born Marie Louise Cruz, a woman of Mexican descent who had entirely fabricated her Apache identity to build a career in activism and entertainment. Brando, the master of manipulation, had used a complete fraud to protest the fraudulence of Hollywood. By the late 1970s, Brando dropped the facade of artistic and moral integrity entirely. He returned to his core tactic, bleeding the studio system for maximum profit while delivering the absolute minimum effort. In 1978, producers Alexander and Ilya Salkind were assembling a massive, unprecedented budget for Superman. They desperately needed a legendary name to legitimize the comic book adaptation. They approached Brando to play Superman's biological father, Jor-El. Brando recognized the producer's desperation and executed one of the most ruthless contract extortions in film history. He agreed to the role but demanded $3.7 million in cash, plus an astonishing 75% of the film's gross profits. He stipulated that he would only work for exactly 12 days. If the production required him for a 13th day, his fee would increase exponentially. To maximize his insult to the comic book material, which he viewed as corporate trash, he actively tried to sabotage the character design. In early meetings with director Richard Donner, Brando seriously suggested that Jor-El should not look like a human being. He argued that since Jor-El was an alien, he could look like a green suitcase. He then suggested he could play the role as a glowing, floating bagel and simply record the voiceover from a studio, eliminating the need for him to physically appear on camera. Donner, terrified of losing his star, had to carefully talk Brando out of playing a pastry. Once on set, Brando refused to memorize a single line of dialogue. He resurrected his cue card system with a new, cynical twist. In a key scene where Jor-El places the infant Superman into an escape pod, Brando demanded the crew write his dialogue directly onto the baby's diaper. When audiences watched the emotional climax of the planet Krypton exploding, they were actually watching Marlon Brando reading his lines off a toddler's underwear. He extracted over $14 million in total compensation for less than 2 weeks of active sabotage. This extreme, unchecked indiscipline reached its horrifying zenith the following year, during the production of Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam War epic, Apocalypse Now. Coppola had mortgaged his own home and risked his entire personal fortune to finance the film, which was shooting in the treacherous jungles of the Philippines. He hired Brando to play Colonel Walter Kurtz, a Green Beret who goes insane and establishes himself as a rogue god king in the Cambodian jungle. Brando's contract guaranteed him $1 million a week for 3 weeks of work. Coppola expected a lean, physically intimidating military man who was well-versed in the film's source material, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Instead, Brando arrived in the Philippines weighing nearly 300 pounds. He was severely obese, incapable of fitting into a military uniform, and admitted he had never bothered to read the script, let alone the original novel. He was completely unprepared. Coppola was thrown into a state of panic. With the budget bleeding out and a massive crew stranded in the jungle, production was forced to halt for days. Coppola literally had to sit in a houseboat with Brando and read Heart of Darkness out loud to him, trying to teach him the fundamental concepts of the character he was being paid millions to play. Because Brando's massive physical size contradicted the script's description of a starving, emaciated soldier, the cinematography had to be entirely reinvented. Brando shaved his own head to look more bizarre and demanded that cinematographer Vittorio Storaro light him almost entirely in shadows. He refused to be filmed from the waist down, forcing the camera to shoot only his floating, shadowed face in extreme close-ups. He refused to learn his lines, choosing instead to improvise long, rambling, incoherent monologues for hours while the cameras rolled, forcing Coppola to sift through thousands of feet of useless film to find a few usable sentences. Brando did not care about the film. He did not care about Coppola's financial ruin, and he did not care about the artistic outcome. Yet, in a testament to the chaotic, unpredictable nature of his talent, his complete refusal to cooperate accidentally generated one of the most chilling aesthetics in cinematic history. The shadowed lighting, the bald head, and the fragmented, whispered dialogue perfectly captured the terrifying madness of the Vietnam War. Brando's sheer, weaponized laziness inadvertently created a masterpiece. He closed out the 1970s having proven that he was utterly untouchable. He had extorted the biggest studios in the world, colluded in the destruction of his co-stars, humiliated the Academy Awards, and hijacked multi-million-dollar productions for his own amusement. He was a man operating with zero accountability, but as he entered the final decades of his life, the psychological and physical wreckage he had inflicted on the world began to turn inward. The isolation he had engineered would soon breed a bizarre, tragic, and entirely self-inflicted destruction. The 1980s marked a dark shift in Marlon Brando's relationship with the world. He had spent the previous 3 decades proving he could break the Hollywood studio system. He had successfully extorted executives, humiliated directors, and hijacked millions of dollars in corporate funds. Having established absolute dominance, he completely lost interest in the battle. He retreated behind the heavy gates of his Mulholland Drive compound in Los Angeles and his private island in Tahiti. When he finally re-emerged to work in the 1990s, the calculated rebellion of his youth had mutated into bizarre, unchecked extortion. He no longer viewed himself as an actor. He viewed himself as a mercenary, and his tactics became indistinguishable from organized crime. In 1990, TriStar Pictures managed to secure Brando for the crime comedy The Freshman, starring alongside Matthew Broderick. The studio banked heavily on Brando, satirizing his own iconic Godfather persona. But during post-production, a financial dispute arose regarding Brando's back-end compensation. Rather than deploying his lawyers to handle the contract dispute, Brando executed a public hostage situation. He contacted the press, specifically the Globe and Mail, and gave a devastating interview. He explicitly called the multi-million-dollar film a turkey. He stated it was a disaster, a terrible movie, and advised the public not to waste their money seeing it. TriStar Pictures panicked. Their lead star was actively destroying the film's marketing campaign weeks before its release. The executives immediately caved to his demands. They wired an additional $1 million directly into Brando's bank account. The very next day, Brando issued a public retraction. He suddenly praised The Freshman as a brilliant comedy and claimed his previous statements were just a misunderstanding. It was a blatant, highly effective corporate shakedown. He proved that his mere words could cost a studio millions, and he charged them a premium to buy his silence. But the absolute peak of his on-set madness occurred in 1996, during the production of The Island of Dr. Moreau. The film, shot in the remote jungles of Australia, is historically regarded as one of the most chaotic, disastrous productions in Hollywood history. The original director, Richard Stanley, was fired early on, and veteran director John Frankenheimer was brought in to salvage the picture. Brando arrived on set completely unhinged. He refused to learn a single line of the script. Instead of using his infamous cue cards, he upgraded his system of sabotage. He demanded to wear a small radio receiver in his ear. He ordered a production assistant to sit in a remote trailer and transmit his lines to him via a microphone, straight into his earpiece while the cameras rolled. However, the radio frequency of Brando's earpiece frequently crossed signals with the local Australian police scanner. During the middle of highly expensive, complex scenes, Brando would suddenly stop acting and begin reciting police dispatch codes to his confused co-stars. In one documented take, Brando stared directly into the camera and loudly announced that there was an armed robbery in progress at a local Woolworths department store. His physical demands were equally absurd. To protest the heat of the jungle, he walked onto the set one morning wearing a metal ice bucket on his head and demanded that it remain on his head while they filmed. The terrified producers, unwilling to risk a delay, ordered the camera crew to shoot around it. He constantly demanded completely irrational script changes to test the limits of his power. At one point, he seriously proposed that his character, the mad scientist Dr. Moreau, should remove his hat halfway through the film to reveal he was actually a dolphin. When the studio rejected the dolphin idea, Brando found a new fixation. He became fascinated by Nelson de la Rosa, a 2-foot-4-inch actor hired as a background extra. Brando halted production and demanded that the script be entirely rewritten to include de la Rosa in all of his scenes. He ordered the wardrobe department to construct an exact miniature replica of his own costume for de la Rosa, forcing the man to act as his silent, bizarre sidekick. Brando was no longer making a movie. He was using a major studio budget to fund his own private surrealist theater. His final act of professional sabotage occurred during his last completed film, The Score. The film was directed by Frank Oz, a highly respected filmmaker and the original voice behind several iconic Jim Henson Muppets, including Miss Piggy and Yoda. Brando immediately decided he despised Oz. He refused to take any direction from him. To humiliate the director, Brando refused to call him by his actual name. In front of the entire cast and crew, Brando exclusively referred to Oz as Miss Piggy or Puppet Boy. The situation deteriorated to the point where Brando flatly refused to be on the set if Oz was present. To get the picture finished, co-star Robert De Niro had to step in. Oz was forced to sit in a separate room, watching the scene on a monitor. He would give his directions to De Niro, and De Niro would then walk onto the set and relay the instructions to Brando. During the shoot, Brando decided the studio lights were too hot. He retreated to his dressing room, removed his pants, and returned to the set wearing only his underwear. He challenged the producers to do something about it. They did nothing. They simply instructed the camera operators to shoot Brando strictly in tight close-ups, from the waist up. He ended his legendary cinematic career in exactly the way he wanted, humiliating the establishment, taking their money, and refusing to wear pants while doing it. The chaos Brando inflicted on film sets was not an isolated professional quirk. It was a direct reflection of his deeply toxic, pathological personal life. He destroyed the people who loved him with the exact same ruthless precision he used to destroy Hollywood productions. Brando maintained absolute control over his private life, which he bluntly described as a telephone book. He cycled through countless affairs, 3 chaotic marriages, and fathered an estimated 11 to 17 children, many out of wedlock. He viewed his romantic partners not as equals, but as subjects to be dominated and manipulated. His relationship with actress Rita Moreno is one of the most brutal examples of his psychological violence. They met in 1954, and Brando subjected Moreno to an 8-year cycle of extreme emotional abuse. He kept her entirely off balance. He would relentlessly pursue her, demand her absolute loyalty, and then openly flagrantly cheat on her, ensuring she always felt inadequate and terrified of losing him. The psychological torture escalated into severe physical trauma. When Moreno became pregnant with Brando's child, he refused to take any responsibility. Instead, he forced her to undergo an illegal back alley abortion. The procedure was botched. The abortionist left the fetus inside her body, leading to massive hemorrhaging. Moreno nearly bled to death and had to be rushed to a hospital for emergency surgery to save her life. Even after nearly killing her, Brando did not stop his psychological games. Shortly after the botched abortion, Brando traveled to Tahiti to film Mutiny on the Bounty and engaged in a highly publicized affair with his young co-star, Tarita Teripaya, whom he later married. When Brando returned to Los Angeles, he callously left Moreno alone in his house. Broken, humiliated, and exhausted by the relentless abuse, Moreno found a bottle of Brando's sleeping pills. She swallowed the entire bottle in a definitive suicide attempt. She was found by Brando's assistant and rushed to the hospital, where her stomach was pumped just in time. She survived, but the relationship finally ended. Years later, when they were cast together in the 1968 film The Night of the Following Day, a scene required Moreno to slap Brando. She did not act. She hit him with such genuine explosive force that it shocked the entire crew. A physical release of 8 years of accumulated trauma. Brando's need for control extended to his male relationships as well. During the 1950s, he recognized that young actor James Dean idolized him. Dean was desperate for Brando's approval and mentorship. Brando recognized this vulnerability and exploited it. According to multiple biographers and contemporaries, Brando engaged in a highly manipulative, allegedly sadomasochistic power dynamic with Dean. He would force Dean into submission, making the younger actor stand outside Brando's apartment in the freezing cold for hours, just begging for a moment of attention. Brando enjoyed breaking people to see how far they would go for his validation. By the mid-1970s, Brando publicly admitted to a fluid sexuality, stating to the press that he, like many men, had homosexual experiences and felt no shame about it. He had documented relationships with several high-profile men, including comedian Richard Pryor and musician Quincy Jones. However, the deepest, most obsessive relationship of Brando's life was with a man who completely contrasted his own hyper-masculine image, the mild-mannered, bespectacled comedian Wally Cox. Brando and Cox had been close friends since childhood. To Brando, Cox was the only person in the world who did not want anything from him. Their bond was absolute and fiercely protective. Brando stated on the record, "If Wally had been a woman, I would have married him." When Cox died suddenly of a massive heart attack in 1973, Brando's reaction bypassed normal grief and entered the realm of severe psychological obsession. Upon hearing the news, Brando rushed to Cox's home. Ignoring Cox's grieving widow, Brando physically climbed through the window of Cox's bedroom and locked himself inside to be with the body. Following the cremation, Cox's widow entrusted Brando with the urn containing the ashes, operating under the strict agreement that Brando would scatter them in the woods where the two men used to hike. Brando lied. He never scattered the ashes. He stole the remains of his best friend. He took the urn back to his Mulholland Drive compound and hid it in his bedroom closet. For decades, he kept the ashes hidden from Cox's family. When he drove around Los Angeles, he kept the urn tucked under the front seat of his car. Every night, in the total isolation of his mansion, Brando would pull the urn out and hold full conversations with the ashes. He could not accept the loss of control that came with death. If he could not have Wally Cox alive, he would possess his remains. Brando surrounded himself with tragedy because he thrived in the center of the wreckage. He was one of the last people to speak with Marilyn Monroe before her fatal overdose in 1962. He maintained until the end of his life that she did not commit suicide, firmly believing she was murdered to cover up her political affairs. He saw conspiracies and darkness everywhere, largely because he was the architect of so much darkness himself. The fortress Marlon Brando, built to keep the world out, ultimately became the site of his total destruction. By 1990, his sprawling compound on Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles was a heavily guarded, isolated sanctuary. He had successfully insulated himself from the Hollywood executives, the press, and the public. He controlled everything inside those walls. But the psychological chaos he had cultivated his entire life, the absolute lack of boundaries and discipline, had infected his own children. The violence he had so effortlessly projected on cinema screens was about to manifest in his own living room. On the evening of May 16, 1990, the Mulholland Drive estate became an active homicide scene. The catalyst was a volatile mix of family dysfunction, substance abuse, and unchecked rage. Brando's 20-year-old daughter, Cheyenne, the child he had with his Tahitian co-star Tarita, was living at the compound. She was heavily pregnant. Also staying at the house was her 26-year-old boyfriend, Dag Drolet, the father of the unborn child. Cheyenne's mental health had been deteriorating rapidly following a severe car accident the previous year that had left her temporarily disfigured. She had begun making erratic, unverified claims to her family that Drolet was physically abusing her. These claims reached Christian Brando, Marlon's 32-year-old eldest son. Christian was the physical embodiment of his father's chaotic personal life. Born to Brando's first wife, Anna Kashfi, Christian's childhood had been a brutal tug-of-war. He was the subject of vicious custody battles, kidnapped by his own mother, and raised in an environment utterly devoid of stability. As an adult, he struggled with severe drug and alcohol addiction, drifting through life anchored only by his father's wealth and name. On that night in May, Christian had been drinking heavily. Armed with a .45 caliber handgun, he confronted Drolet in the living room of the Brando estate regarding the alleged abuse of his half-sister. According to the forensic evidence and police reports, an altercation ensued. Christian raised the weapon. A single bullet was fired at close range. It struck Dag Drolet directly in the face, severing his brainstem and killing him instantly. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the compound. Marlon Brando, who was in another room, rushed to the scene. The man who had spent his life playing mob bosses and hardened criminals was suddenly confronted with real, irreversible bloodshed. He found Drolet's lifeless body on the floor of his den, the television still playing in the background. Brando frantically attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but the catastrophic trauma to Drolet's head was fatal. At 10:20 p.m., Marlon Brando placed a 911 call to the Los Angeles Police Department. When the LAPD arrived at the gates of the infamous estate, they did not find an untouchable cinematic icon. They found a frantic, terrified father trying to manage a catastrophic crime scene. Christian was immediately arrested, handcuffed, and placed in the back of a squad car. The police confiscated several firearms from the residence, including an assault rifle, a shotgun, and the .45 caliber murder weapon. By sunrise, the Mulholland compound was surrounded by news helicopters and media vans. The Hollywood establishment, which Brando had spent decades humiliating and extorting, watched in stunned silence as their greatest anti-hero was brought to his knees by a domestic tragedy. The illusion of his invincibility was permanently shattered. Christian Brando was formally charged with first-degree murder. The legal proceedings that followed became a grotesque media spectacle, draining both Brando's massive financial reserves and his remaining psychological fortitude. Brando hired Robert Shapiro, one of the most expensive and aggressive defense attorneys in Los Angeles. To secure Christian's release pending trial, the judge set an astronomical bail of $2 million. Brando, whose liquidity had been decimated by decades of reckless spending and alimony payments, was forced to put up his beloved Mulholland estate as collateral to buy his son's temporary freedom. The legal strategy was built on damage control. Shapiro argued that the shooting was accidental, claiming that Drolet had tried to wrestle the gun away from Christian, causing it to discharge during the struggle. But the prosecution focused on Christian's intoxication and the fact that he had brought a loaded weapon to a confrontation. The climax of the legal battle occurred during a preliminary hearing, an event that provided the public with the most raw, unscripted performance of Marlon Brando's life. The man who had weaponized his emotions for the camera for 40 years was forced to take the witness stand in a Los Angeles courthouse. Under oath, Brando broke down completely. He wept uncontrollably in front of the judge, the press, and the family of the victim. The legendary voice that had defined American cinema was reduced to choked, desperate sobs. He turned to the Drolet family in the gallery and pleaded for forgiveness. Then, confronting the prosecution's questions about his son's upbringing, Brando delivered a devastating, factual assessment of his own life. "I think that perhaps I failed as a father," Brando testified. He openly admitted that the chaotic environment he created, his endless string of affairs, and his inability to provide structural discipline had directly contributed to the tragedy. He had spent his entire life running from the violent, abusive legacy of his own father, Marlon Sr., only to realize he had passed a different, equally lethal form of chaos down to his own son. The psychological defense mechanisms he built as a child had successfully protected him from the world, but they had left him completely incapable of raising a stable family. Facing overwhelming forensic evidence and the possibility of a life sentence, the defense negotiated a plea bargain. In 1991, Christian Brando pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years in a state penitentiary. Brando watched as armed guards escorted his eldest son away to prison. The financial cost of the legal defense was staggering, virtually wiping out the millions of dollars Brando had ruthlessly extracted from the studio system over the previous decades. But the tragedy of the murder was only the beginning of a relentless sequence of biological and psychological consequences. The collateral damage of the shooting focused entirely on Cheyenne. Following the death of Drolet, she fled Los Angeles and retreated to Tahiti, refusing to return to the United States to testify at Christian's trial. Shortly after the murder, she gave birth to Drolet's son, Tuki. But the trauma of losing her partner at the hands of her own brother broke her mind completely. Cheyenne spiraled into severe clinical schizophrenia. She was in and out of psychiatric institutions in Paris and Tahiti for the next 5 years. She heavily abused drugs and made multiple suicide attempts. Brando, trapped in Los Angeles by his failing health and financial ruin, could do nothing but watch from a distance as his daughter disintegrated. Eventually, a Tahitian court deemed her entirely unfit to be a mother and stripped her of the custody of her son, handing the boy over to Drolet's parents. The loss of her child was the final blow. On April 16, 1995, at the age of 25, Cheyenne Brando went into the bedroom of her mother's home in Punauia, Tahiti. She tied a rope, secured it, and hanged herself. When the news of his daughter's suicide reached Mulholland Drive, Marlon Brando's psychological collapse was absolute. He was physically and emotionally incapable of traveling to Tahiti for the funeral. He locked himself inside his compound. He severed almost all remaining ties with the outside world. The man who had once demanded that film crews wait hours for the perfect wave in the ocean now refused to leave his bedroom. The final decade of Marlon Brando's life was defined by a horrifying, self-inflicted physical deterioration. He engaged in a slow, methodical suicide by consumption. He used food as a brutal, numbing anesthetic to block out the reality of his ruined family and his depleted fortune. His binge eating became entirely uncontrollable. He consumed massive quantities of ice cream, whole pies, and heavily processed meats daily. His weight skyrocketed past 300 pounds, eventually peaking near an estimated 375 pounds. His body, which had once been the global gold standard for male physicality, buckled under the extreme strain. The medical consequences were severe and compounding. He developed advanced type 2 diabetes. The disease ravaged his nervous system and severely damaged his eyesight, leaving him legally blind in his final years. He could no longer read scripts, watch films, or even clearly see the faces of the few people allowed into his home. His massive weight gain also triggered severe pulmonary fibrosis and congestive heart failure. His heart simply could no longer pump blood efficiently through his enormous frame. He required the constant use of portable oxygen tanks just to breathe while resting. The physical effort required to walk from his bed to the bathroom became too taxing. Rather than expending the energy, he resorted to urinating in empty bottles, leaving them scattered across the floor beneath his bed. The situation inside the house became so dire that his remaining staff and family members resorted to extreme measures. At one point, they were forced to wrap heavy metal chains around the industrial refrigerator in his kitchen and lock it with a padlock to physically prevent him from eating himself into a diabetic coma during the night. Brando, operating purely on addiction, would often manage to pick the locks or bribe the domestic staff to sneak massive amounts of fast food over the compound walls. He spent his final years living in almost total darkness. He rarely allowed the curtains to be opened. He sat in his bedroom, tethered to an oxygen machine, listening to the police scanner on his ham radio. The industry he had conquered continued to function just down the hill in Hollywood, entirely indifferent to the fact that its greatest icon was slowly suffocating to death in a dark room. The end came exactly as his doctors had predicted. In late June 2004, Brando's failing respiratory system finally gave out. He was rushed to the Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. The medical staff attempted to stabilize him, but his organs were completely exhausted. There was no media spectacle, no grand final monologue, and no studio executives waiting outside his door. On July 1, 2004, at the age of 80, Marlon Brando died of pulmonary fibrosis and congestive heart failure. He did not leave behind a clean, peaceful legacy. He left behind a chaotic, heavily disputed estate that perfectly mirrored the disorder of his life. At the time of his death, he was deeply in debt, owing millions in unpaid taxes and legal fees. However, the future royalties of his image and his remaining property were still highly valuable. Almost immediately after his death, the Mulholland compound became the center of a vicious legal war. Brando had fathered children with multiple women, legally adopted several others, and employed a revolving door of assistants, maids, and business managers. Within weeks, 24 separate lawsuits were filed in the Los Angeles probate courts. The primary dispute centered on a highly suspicious amendment to his will. Just weeks before he died, while he was heavily medicated, blind, and struggling to breathe, his will was allegedly altered. The amendment removed his longtime personal assistant and his financial manager from their roles as executors, replacing them with Hollywood producer Mike Medavoy and 2 other associates. Furthermore, a former maid, Angela Borlaza, filed a massive lawsuit against the estate. She claimed that Brando had illegally adopted her, promised her a house, and that the executors had forged Brando's signature on the final documents because his hands were too weak to hold a pen. The legal battles dragged on for years, burning through whatever remaining capital the estate generated. His children fought each other in court, his former lovers sued for unpaid support, and the lawyers profited off the wreckage. The story of Marlon Brando is not a story about the magic of cinema. It is a documented study of trauma, exploitation, and the ultimate cost of operating without accountability. He survived a violently abusive childhood by learning how to manipulate the psychology of the people around him. When he brought that survival mechanism to New York and Los Angeles, the entertainment industry recognized its commercial value. The studio system packaged his deep, unresolved psychological wounds, labeled it method acting, and sold it to the masses. They demanded that he bleed for the camera, and in return, they gave him unprecedented wealth, global fame, and absolute power. But the system failed to realize that they were arming a man who despised authority. Brando took the money and the power, and he turned it against the industry. He proved that the rigid, Capitalist structure of Hollywood could be broken by a single individual willing to utilize extreme indiscipline and financial sabotage. He extorted the executives, humiliated the directors, and systematically dismantled the golden age of the studio system. Yet, in his relentless pursuit to destroy the systems that tried to control him, he destroyed every structure in his own life. He weaponized his trauma so effectively that he forgot how to exist outside of it. He insulated himself from the consequences of his professional actions, but he could not escape the biological and psychological reality of his choices. The violence he glorified on stage and screen mutated into the real, fatal violence that consumed his son, drove his daughter to suicide, and left him to die alone, blind, and chained to an oxygen tank in the dark. The Hollywood machine did not break Marlon Brando. It simply fed him until he devoured himself.